The wind howled through the dense forest, carrying with it the cruel bite of winter. Snowflakes swirled in the icy air, blanketing the ground in a thick, merciless sheet of white. It was a night of death, a night where the weak perished, swallowed by the cold. Yet, through the unforgiving blizzard, a lone figure moved. A mother bobcat, her golden eyes burning with desperation, trudged through the knee-deep snow. Her paws, raw and bleeding from the icy terrain, trembled with exhaustion. But she did not stop. She could not stop, because in her jaws she carried her cub. A tiny, frail body dangled limply between her teeth. The cub's fur was coated in frost, his breaths so shallow they were barely there. His small limbs hung motionless, lifeless. The mother let out a low, heart-wrenching whimper. She pressed her nose against her cub's fur. Still warm, but for how much longer? Her body ached. Her strength was failing, but she forced herself forward. She had been running for hours, searching, hoping, praying. And now, in the distance through the swirling snow, she saw it, a cabin, the only sign of life in this frozen wasteland. She had seen the old woman before, the human who lived there, the one who fed the birds, who left scraps for the small creatures of the woods. A human, yes, but not like the others. Would she help? Could she? The mother bobcat had no reason to trust humans. She had spent her life avoiding them, teaching her cubs to fear them. But now none of that mattered. Her instinct screamed at her to turn back, to hide. But a mother's love was stronger than fear. With the last of her strength, she reached the cabin's porch and collapsed. Inside, Eleanor sat in her wooden rocking chair, staring into the flickering flames of the fireplace. The warmth seeped into her aching bones, soothing the years of wear and tear. Outside, the wind howled, rattling the windows. Eleanor took a slow sip of her tea, savoring the heat. The night was bitter, the kind that swallowed life whole. She had seen it too many times before. Then, something strange happened. A sound, soft, almost imperceptible beneath the storm. She frowned, setting her cup down. It came again, a faint, desperate cry. Not the wind, not the creaking trees. Something else, something alive. Eleanor pushed herself up, her joints protesting. She moved to the frost-covered window and peered outside, her breath caught in her throat. A bobcat. No, a mother bobcat. And at her feet, a motionless cub. Eleanor's heart pounded. She had lived in these woods for decades, had seen animals in every state of survival, but never had she seen one bring its young to a human's door. She stared into the mother's eyes, wild, desperate, pleading. The old woman didn't hesitate. She grabbed a thick wool blanket and her medical kit before pulling open the door. A rush of icy air bit her face, stealing her breath, but she didn't care. The mother bobcat tensed. Eleanor moved slowly, lowering herself to the snow-covered porch. Her hands shook, not from the cold, but from the sheer weight of the moment. Carefully, she reached out. The mother bobcat let out a low, warning growl, but it was weak, uncertain. "I'm not going to hurt him," Eleanor whispered, her voice barely louder than the wind. For a long, breathless moment, neither moved. Then, with a heartbreaking whimper, the mother nudged her cub forward. Eleanor's eyes burned with emotion as she gently scooped the tiny body into her hands. Cold, too cold. She pressed her fingers to his ribs, searching for life. Nothing. Her stomach twisted. She pressed her ear against his tiny chest. Please, please. Then, so faint, so fragile, she felt it. A heartbeat. Weak, sluggish. But there, the old woman exhaled sharply, her breath shaking. He was alive. But not for long if she didn't act fast. She wrapped the cub in the wool blanket, cradling him close to her chest. The mother bobcat let out an anxious sound, stepping forward. Eleanor met her gaze. "Come in." The mother hesitated. Snow clung to her fur, her body trembling violently. She looked past Eleanor into the warmth of the cabin. Another gust of wind howled through the night, cutting like a blade. The mother shivered, and then, as if making a final, desperate choice, she stepped inside. Eleanor shut the door behind them, sealing out the deadly cold. The fire cast a soft, golden glow of the room, making the ice in the mother's fur glisten. She stood near the entrance, muscles coiled, eyes darting around, but she did not run. She watched. Eleanor moved quickly, placing the cub near the fire, still wrapped in the blanket. She grabbed a heating pad from her medical kit, warming it in her hands before tucking it under the cub's tiny body. The mother bobcat let out a soft, anxious sound, stepping closer. He's still breathing, Eleanor assured her, though she wasn't sure the bobcat could understand. Minutes passed, agonizing, endless minutes. Eleanor rubbed the cub's fur, trying to stimulate circulation, trying to pull him back from the edge. Then, a twitch. A tiny paw flinched beneath the blanket. Eleanor's breath caught. She leaned in closer, heart pounding. The cub let out a weak, barely audible whimper. Outside, the storm raged. The wind howled. The snow fell. But inside the cabin, beneath the glow of the fire, life had not given up yet. The old cabin was silent, except for the soft crackling of the fire and the faint howling of the storm outside. Eleanor sat cross-legged on the wooden floor, her gaze locked on the tiny cub wrapped in wool. His body remained still, his breast shallow, but the small twitch of his paw had sparked a fragile hope inside her. The mother bobcat had not moved from the doorway, though she had entered the warmth of the cabin. She remained tense, her muscles coiled, her eyes fixed on her cub. Every few seconds, she let out a low, uneasy sound, almost as if urging the tiny creature to wake up. Eleanor knew time was running out. The cub was alive, but barely. She reached for a small towel, dipping into a bowl of warm water. Gently, she dabbed it along the cub's frozen fur, hoping to melt away the frost that clung to his tiny body. His ears twitched slightly at the sensation, another small sign of life. "Come on, little one," Eleanor murmured. "Stay with us." The mother bobcat took a hesitant step closer. Eleanor could feel her gaze burning into her hands, watching her every movement. The bond between them was still thin, held together only by desperation. But Eleanor needed the mother to understand. She was trying to help. She glanced up, her voice soft but firm. "He needs warm food and time." The bobcat didn't move, but she didn't back away either. Eleanor turned back to the cub, her mind racing. He needed energy. He needed something to help his little body fight. Her eyes flickered toward the kitchen. Milk. It wasn't the perfect solution. Bobcats weren't meant to drink cow's milk. But right now, anything was better than nothing. She quickly stood and walked toward the kitchen, her steps careful, measured. The mother bobcat let out a low growl at the movement, but Eleanor didn't react. She simply opened the cupboard, pulled out a small saucepan, and poured a bit of milk into it. As the liquid warmed on the stove, she grabbed a clean dropper. The mother bobcat had inched closer now, standing just a few feet away from the fire, her ears flicking uncertainly. Eleanor filled the dropper and returned to the cub. Kneeling, she placed the warm milk near his mouth. Would he drink? Could he? For a long moment, nothing happened. Then, the tiniest movement. His little pink tongue flickered out, touching the dropper's tip. Eleanor's heart pounded. Yes, that's it. Slowly, carefully, she squeezed a drop of milk into his mouth. The cub swallowed weakly, his body still barely responding, but was enough. The mother bobcat let out a sharp sound, a mix of tension and hope. Eleanor gave another drop, then another. With each sip, the cub's breathing seemed to grow slightly stronger. His tiny body was still dangerously weak, but now he was fighting. Eleanor exhaled a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. She glanced at the mother bobcat, who was staring at her with something unreadable in her wild eyes. Trust? Fear? A silent plea? "I told you," Eleanor whispered. "I'm helping." For the first time, the mother bobcat didn't growl. She simply sat down. Minutes turned into hours. Eleanor worked tirelessly, alternating between rubbing warmth into the cub's fur, feeding him tiny drops of milk, and keeping him as close to the fire as possible without overheating him. The mother bobcat never left the side. She sat close now, still tense but no longer on the verge of bolting. Every so often, she licked the cub's head, her rough tongue brushing over his soft fur. It was a mother's touch, a silent reassurance that she was still here. Eleanor couldn't help but marvel at it. How far had this mother come to save her baby? How much fear had she swallowed to bring him here? She knew animals had instincts, but this was something more. This was love. Outside, the blizzard raged on. Snow piled against the windows, the wind howling through the trees. The world beyond the cabin was a frozen wasteland, a place where only the strongest survived. But inside, a battle was being fought, and Eleanor was determined to win. As the night stretched on, exhaustion pulled at Eleanor's body. She hadn't slept, hadn't even sat down properly since the Bobcat arrived. But she couldn't stop, not yet. She glanced at the clock. 3:42 a.m. The fire had burned low, its embers glowing softly in the dim room. The cub had stopped shivering now, his breath steady, but he was still too weak to move. Eleanor stifled a yawn. Just a little longer. She adjusted the blanket around the cub, making sure he stayed warm. Then, leaning back against her chair, she closed her eyes for just a moment. Just one moment. A sound woke her. Not the wind, not the crackling fire. Something else. She opened her eyes, blinking through the haze of sleep. The room was still dim, bathed in the soft glow of the firelight. And then she saw it. The cub. He was moving. Not much, just a small, sluggish stretch of his paws. But it was movement. Eleanor's heart leaped. She quickly leaned forward, watching in disbelief. The cub let out the tiniest, hoarse little cry, a whisper of sound, but to Eleanor, it was the most beautiful thing she had ever heard. The mother bobcat was already at his side, licking his face, nudging him gently. She let out a soft, rumbling sound, something between a purr and a growl. Eleanor swallowed the lump in her throat. They had done it. He was coming back. But then, just as relief began to wash over her, something else happened. The mother bobcat stiffened. Her ears twitched. Her body tensed. Eleanor frowned. What is it? Then she heard it too. A sound, distant but growing closer. Something, or someone was outside the cabin. Eleanor slowly turned toward the window. Through the frost-covered glass, she could see nothing but snow and darkness. But the feeling in her gut was unmistakable. They were not alone. Eleanor's breath hitched as she stared at the window. The sound outside was faint but unmistakable. Something was moving in the snow. The mother bobcat was already on high alert. Her ears perked, her muscles coiled. She let out a low, warning growl. Her sharp eyes locked on the door. Eleanor swallowed hard. Out here in the wilderness, unexpected visitors were rare and rarely friendly. Was it a predator? A wolf? Drawn by the scent of weakness? Or worse, a human? Her hands instinctively tightened around the old blanket draped over her shoulders. Living alone for years had made her cautious. Who would be out in a blizzard like this? The snow crunched again. Closer this time. Eleanor's pulse pounded. She had to do something. She stood slowly, careful not to startle the bobcat. The fire cast flickering shadows along the cabin walls as she moved toward the door. She hesitated for just a moment before reaching for the rifle she kept near the coat rack. Not to shoot, just in case. The mother bobcat let out another warning growl, her body tense, shielding her cub. Then a knock. Not a loud one, not urgent, just deliberate. Eleanor's breath caught. A knock? Out here? Her fingers hovered over the door handle. Her mind raced. No one ever came this far into the woods. No one. Another knock. More insistent this time. The mother bobcat was staring at the door now, her eyes sharp, unblinking. She knew something was wrong. Eleanor's voice came out quieter than she intended. Who's there? Silence. She felt the weight of the storm pressing against the cabin walls, the wind howling through the trees. Then, a voice. Weak, tired, human. Help. Eleanor's stomach twisted. It wasn't a hunter, not a predator. Someone was out there, in the middle of the storm, asking for help. She turned to the bobcat. The wild animal was still on edge, her instincts screaming danger. But Eleanor knew that hesitation could mean the difference between life and death. For whoever was out there, she made her decision. Taking a deep breath, she unlatched the door and pulled it open. The wind hit her like a wave, bitter cold slicing through her like a knife. Snow swirled in the air, blinding her for a moment. But then she saw him, a man, half buried in the snow, barely standing, leaning against the doorframe. His face was pale, his lips cracked and blue. His clothes were soaked through, his arms wrapped tightly around himself as he swayed on his feet. Eleanor barely caught him before he collapsed. Hey, stay with me. She gritted her teeth, struggling under his weight as she pulled him inside. The mother bobcat let out a sharp growl, but Eleanor shot her a firm look. Not now. The bobcat didn't move, but her growl faded into silence. Eleanor dragged the man toward the fire, lowering him onto the old rug. He groaned weakly, his body trembling. His eyes fluttered open, dark brown, full of exhaustion, full of something else too, relief. Thank you, he whispered. Eleanor frowned, studying him. His face was thin, his beard patchy, like he hadn't eaten properly in days. Who was he? Why was he out here? She quickly grabbed a spare blanket, wrapping it around his shivering body. What happened to you? The man coughed, his voice hoarse. Lost Storm, been walking for hours. Eleanor's chest tightened. If he had been out there much longer, he wouldn't have survived. She reached for the pot hanging over the fire, pouring him a small cup of warm broth. Drink this. He took it with shaky hands, sipping slowly. Color began returning to his face. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The storm continued to rage outside, the fire crackling softly. The mother bobcat hadn't moved from her spot, her golden eyes still locked onto the stranger. Eleanor studied him carefully. He looked familiar. Then it clicked. She narrowed her eyes. You're from the town, aren't you? The man blinked in surprise. Eleanor's voice hardened. I remember you. You work at the supply store. What are you doing all the way out here? He hesitated. Then, with a slow, shuddering breath, he whispered, I was looking for you. Eleanor's heart skipped a beat. For years, she had lived alone, keeping her distance from town. No one ever came looking for her. Her voice was wary. Why? The man set the empty cup down, rubbing his hands together for warmth. His gaze flickered toward the mother bobcat and her cub. Then he sighed. There's been talk, he admitted. Stories about you. People say you live out here with wild animals, that you take care of them. Eleanor stiffened. She didn't like where this was going. The man continued. A few days ago I saw a bobcat, injured, looked like she had a cub with her. He glanced at the mother bobcat, who was still watching him warily. I followed her tracks. Then the storm hit. I got lost. Eleanor clenched her jaw. He had been tracking the bobcat. Were you planning to hunt her? She asked, her voice sharp. The man shook his head quickly. No, I swear. I wanted to see if the stories were true. Eleanor studied him, searching for any hint of a lie. His eyes held something strange. Not greed, not malice, curiosity, maybe even admiration. Eleanor exhaled slowly. She wasn't sure if she trusted him yet, but for now, he wasn't a threat. She leaned back, rubbing her temples. Well, congratulations. You found me. The man gave a tired chuckle. Guess I did. Silence settled between them. The fire crackled. The blizzard howled. The mother bobcat, still protective but no longer hostile, curled around her cub, licking his fur. Finally, Eleanor spoke. You can stay until the storm passes. The man nodded gratefully. Thank you. She gave him one last warning glance. But when it does, you go back to town. And you don't tell anyone about this place. The man hesitated. Then, with a small, knowing smile, he said, Who would believe me anyway? Eleanor huffed, shaking her head. He was right. Some things were too incredible to be believed. The storm outside showed no signs of stopping. The wind howled through the trees, rattling the wooden cabin as if demanding to be let in. Inside, the fire crackled warmly, casting flickering shadows across the walls. Eleanor sat in her old rocking chair, her sharp eyes never leaving the stranger she had let into her home. The man, who had nearly frozen to death outside, was now sitting near the fire, slowly regaining his strength. His clothes were still damp, but his face had some color now, his shivering less violent. The mother bobcat remained curled around her cub, her body tense, ears flicking at every slight movement the man made. She still didn't trust him. Eleanor didn't blame her. "You never told me your name," she said, breaking the silence. The man looked up, his hands wrapped around the warm cup of broth she had given him earlier. "Daniel," he answered. Eleanor nodded slowly. "You work at the supply store, right?" Daniel gave a tired chuckle. "So you do remember me." "I remember most people," Eleanor replied. "I just choose not to talk to them." Daniel let out a small breath of amusement. "Yeah, I noticed." Eleanor didn't respond. She wasn't in the mood for small talk. She wanted answers. With a sharp gaze, she asked, "Why were you really following the bobcat?" Daniel hesitated. He looked at the mother bobcat, then at Eleanor, as if trying to decide how much to say. Finally, he sighed. "It wasn't just curiosity." Eleanor narrowed her eyes. Daniel ran a hand through his damp hair. "A few days ago, a hunter came into town, talking about a wounded bobcat with a cub. He said he saw her limping near the ridge." Eleanor's stomach twisted. She already knew where this was going. Daniel continued. "He said she wouldn't survive long in this weather, that if no one got to her first, the wolves would." Eleanor's grip on her chair tightened. "I heard him talking to some other guys at the store," Daniel went on. "They were planning to track her down, either to put her out of her misery or," he hesitated before finishing, "or take her fur." The mother bobcat let out a low growl, as if she understood every word. Eleanor felt anger rising in her chest. She had lived in these woods long enough to know the way hunters thought. They didn't see wild animals as living, feeling creatures. They saw trophies. "I didn't like the idea," Daniel said, "so I decided to go out first. I wanted to find her before they did." Eleanor studied him carefully. "And what were you going to do if you found her?" Daniel met her gaze. "Help her." Silence settled between them. For the first time, Eleanor saw something in Daniel's eyes that she hadn't noticed before. It wasn't just determination, it was kindness, maybe even guilt. He wasn't like the others. Finally, Eleanor exhaled. "Well, you found her." Daniel looked at the bobcat, who was still curled protectively around her cub. The little one stirred slightly, his breathing more even than before. "She was lucky," Daniel said. "She found you." Eleanor scoffed. "I didn't exactly invite her in." "No," Daniel said with a small smile. "But you didn't turn her away either." Eleanor shook her head, standing up. "Wild animals don't come to humans for no reason." She knew she couldn't survive out there, and she knew I could help. She turned to the mother bobcat, speaking more to herself than to Daniel. "You did the hardest thing a mother could do, didn't you?" she murmured. "You trusted a stranger with your child." The mother bobcat blinked slowly, her body relaxing just a little. Daniel watched the interaction in quiet amazement. "I don't think anyone in town would believe this if they saw it." Eleanor smirked. "Good thing no one will." Daniel chuckled, but then turned serious. "Those hunters, they're probably still looking for her." Eleanor's jaw tightened. She knew it was true, and if the storm let up, they might be closer than she wanted. "We can't let them find her," Daniel said. Eleanor looked at him, weighing her options. She had spent years avoiding people, living in isolation, and protecting the animals that sought refuge near her home. But this time, she wasn't sure she could do it alone. "Then we'll have to move fast," she finally said. Daniel frowned. "Move fast? What do you mean?" Eleanor grabbed her coat from the hook by the door. "We're taking them deeper into the woods. Somewhere safe. Somewhere those hunters won't think to look." Daniel's eyes widened. "You want to move them now? In this storm?" Eleanor nodded. "It's our best chance. The snow will cover our tracks. If we wait until morning, the storm might clear, and those hunters might get too close." Daniel hesitated, but then nodded. "Okay, what do we need to do?" Eleanor turned to the bobcat. "She trusts me just enough to let me help, but she'll need to trust you too." Daniel looked at the wildcat warily. "And how do I do that?" Eleanor smirked. "Try not to get eaten. Daniel shot her an unimpressed look, but she was already moving. She grabbed an old, thick blanket and knelt beside the mother bobcat. Slowly, carefully, she reached toward the cub. The mother tensed but didn't lash out. "Easy," Eleanor murmured. "We're just helping." She carefully wrapped the cub in a blanket, making sure to keep its little head exposed so it could breathe. Then she gently lifted the bundle into her arms. The mother bobcat let out a low, anxious sound, but Eleanor soothed her with a steady voice. "We're taking him somewhere safe. You'll be with him the whole time." The bobcat flicked her ears but didn't resist. Daniel grabbed another blanket and wrapped it around himself. "Where exactly are we going?" Eleanor secured the cub in her arms and moved toward the door. "There's a hidden cave deeper in the woods. I found it years ago. No hunters, no wolves, nothing. It's the safest place I know." Daniel nodded. "Then let's go." Eleanor turned to the mother bobcat. "Come on, girl. Stay close." The bobcat hesitated for just a moment. Then, as if making her own decision, she rose to her feet and followed. With one final glance at the warm cabin, Eleanor pulled open the door. The storm greeted them with a fierce gust of wind, snow whipping around them. But they stepped out anyway, 2 humans and a mother bobcat, disappearing into the night, because some things were worth risking everything for. The cold was relentless. Snow swirled in thick gusts, covering the ground in an unforgiving white blanket. Every breath Eleanor took sent a sharp chill through her lungs, but she didn't slow down. Daniel walked beside her, his shoulders hunched against the icy wind. He carried a lantern, its flickering light barely cutting through the darkness. Behind them, the mother bobcat moved silently, her golden eyes glowing in the dim light, her body tense as she stayed close to Eleanor, never letting the cub out of her sight. Eleanor kept her grip firm on the small bundle wrapped in the blanket. The cub stirred weakly now and then, letting out faint sounds. It was still alive, but for how long? Daniel spoke through the howling wind. "How far is this place?" "Not far," Eleanor answered. "Just beyond the ridge." Daniel glanced at the towering, snow-covered trees around them. "You really think the hunters won't find us there?" Eleanor gave him a sharp look. "I've lived in these woods for 40 years, boy. I know where people don't go." Daniel didn't argue. He just adjusted his scarf and kept walking. The climb up the ridge was slow and difficult. The snow made every step treacherous, the ground uneven beneath them. Eleanor's legs ached, but she didn't stop. The cub in her arms needed warmth. It needed safety. The mother bobcat suddenly let out a low growl, her ears flicking back. Eleanor and Daniel froze. "What is it?" Daniel whispered. Eleanor scanned the darkness. The trees were thick, their branches heavy with snow, but she couldn't see anything unusual. The wind howled through the woods, shaking the branches. But then, a sound, faint, distant, a sharp crack, like a branch snapping underfoot. Someone was out there. Eleanor's stomach tightened. "We need to move. Now." Daniel didn't question her. He tightened his grip on the lantern and picked up his pace. Eleanor followed, her boots crunching through the deep snow. The bobcat stayed right beside her, moving with tense, cautious steps. They reached the top of the ridge just as another sound echoed through the trees, this time much closer. A whistle, sharp, deliberate. Daniel's face paled. "That's them, isn't it?" Eleanor didn't answer. She didn't need to. The hunters were near. The mother bobcat let out a deep, warning growl, her fur bristling. Eleanor's grip on the cub tightened. "We have to get to the cave. It's not far." They hurried forward, their footprints quickly being erased by the falling snow. Eleanor's heart pounded, not from exhaustion, but from the fear that they wouldn't make it in time. Then just ahead, she saw it, the entrance to the cave. A dark opening, half hidden by snow-covered rocks and thick, twisting tree roots. It was just big enough for them to crawl through. "We're here," Eleanor said. "Get inside. Now." Daniel didn't hesitate. He crouched low, squeezing through the entrance. Eleanor followed, carefully maneuvering so the cub wouldn't be jostled. The mother bobcat was the last to enter, her body moving smoothly through the narrow gap. her eyes still darting toward the forest behind them. The inside of the cave was cold but dry. The walls were lined with smooth stone, and the air smelled of earth and damp moss. Eleanor let out a breath of relief. They had made it. Daniel set the lantern down, its glow casting long shadows on the walls. Now what? Eleanor gently unwrapped the cub, checking its breathing. Still alive, but its fur was damp, its body trembling. It needed warmth, fast. She looked at Daniel. We need to build a fire. Daniel nodded and started gathering small sticks and dry moss from a pile near the cave's entrance. Eleanor had stored supplies here long ago, just in case. She never thought she'd need them like this. The mother bobcat settled beside Eleanor, her eyes locked on the cub. Eleanor met the wildcat's gaze. He's going to be okay, she murmured. The bobcat blinked slowly. Maybe she understood. Maybe she didn't. But she didn't move away. Daniel got the fire going quickly. The flames flickered to life, casting a warm glow inside the cave. Eleanor held the cub closer, letting the heat soak into its fur. For a while, no one spoke. They just listened to crackling fire, the wind howling outside. Then Daniel broke the silence. Do you think they'll find us? Eleanor stared into the flames. Not tonight. The snow will cover our tracks. Daniel let out a breath. And after that, Eleanor's jaw tightened. After that, we make sure they never come near her again. Daniel looked at her, surprised. What do you mean? Eleanor turned to the bobcat, who was still watching them closely. She can't stay here forever. She's a wild animal. She needs to be somewhere safe, somewhere those hunters won't find her. Daniel nodded slowly. So, we take her further into mountains? Eleanor sighed. It's risky, but it might be her only chance. Daniel looked at the mother bobcat, then back at Eleanor. And what about you? You're risking a lot for her. Eleanor gave a small, tired smile. I've spent my whole life in these woods. I've seen a lot of things, but I've never seen an animal ask for help. She looked down at the cub, who was breathing more steadily now, its small body finally warming up. I couldn't turn her away. Daniel was silent for a moment. Then he nodded. You're a good person, Eleanor. Eleanor scoffed. Don't get soft on me, boy. Daniel chuckled. No promises. Outside, the wind howled louder. The storm was still raging. But inside the cave, they were safe for now. The mother bobcat curled around her cub. Her body relaxed for the first time since she had arrived at Eleanor's doorstep. She trusted them. And Eleanor knew, deep in her heart, that she wouldn't let her down. The storm outside raged on, winds howling through the trees, carrying with them the chilling bite of winter. Inside the cave, the fire crackled softly, casting flickering shadows on the walls. The warmth had finally settled into the cub's tiny body, its breathing steady but weak. Eleanor sat near the fire, her hands stretched out to soak in the heat. The mother bobcat had curled around her cub, shielding it with her body, her golden eyes still filled with worry. Daniel, sitting against the cave wall, exhaled deeply. We should rest while we can, he muttered, rubbing his arms. Eleanor nodded, though sleep felt impossible. Her mind was too restless, filled with thoughts of what lay ahead. The hunters were still out there, searching. The storm had bought them time, but not enough. She turned to the bobcat. You knew, didn't you? She murmured. You knew you couldn't do this alone. The bobcat blinked at her slowly, her ears twitching. Daniel let out a quiet chuckle. You talk to animals a lot? Eleanor shot him a look. More than I talk to people. Daniel smirked. Makes sense. They fell into silence again, the fire their only comfort. Then, a sound, faint but distinct, a crunching noise from outside, footsteps in the snow. Eleanor's muscles tensed. She turned sharply to Daniel, who had already grabbed a lantern and put out the fire in one swift motion. Darkness swallowed the cave, leaving only the sound of their breathing and the distant howl of the wind. The mother bobcat let out a soft growl, low and warning. She sensed it too. Someone was out there. Eleanor's mind raced. Had the hunters found them? The storm should have covered their tracks. But they had been too slow getting here. Then, another sound. Closer this time. Daniel's breathing was shallow. "What do we do?" he whispered. Eleanor pressed a finger to her lips. "Listen." For a moment, nothing. Then, a voice. "Tracks lead this way." Eleanor's stomach twisted. Another voice, gruff and impatient. "Damn storm is messing everything up. You sure?" A pause. Then, "Yeah, there's a cave up ahead. If they're in there, we've got them trapped." Eleanor clenched her fists. Trapped. That was the last thing she wanted to hear. Daniel's grip tightened on the lantern. "We can't fight them," he whispered. Eleanor knew he was right, but they couldn't just sit here and wait. She looked at the bobcat, then at the small cub nestled beside her. They had to get them out. Slowly, she leaned toward Daniel, her voice barely a breath. "There's another way out." Daniel's eyes widened. "Where?" Eleanor pointed to the far end of the cave, where a narrow passage disappeared into darkness. "It leads to an opening on the other side of the ridge. It's tight, but we can squeeze through." Daniel hesitated. "And if they get here before we're out?" Eleanor's jaw tightened. "Then we make sure they don't follow." The mother bobcat, sensing their urgency, nudged her cub, licking its head softly before looking back at Eleanor. She was ready. Daniel moved quickly, grabbing whatever supplies they could carry. Eleanor wrapped the cub in a warm cloth, keeping it close to her chest as they crept toward the hidden tunnel. The voices outside grew louder. "Hurry!" Eleanor whispered. Daniel crawled in first, maneuvering through the narrow space. Eleanor followed, the bobcat right behind her. The passage was damp, the air thick with the smell of earth and stone. It was barely wide enough for them to move through, but it was their only chance. Behind them, a loud crack echoed through the cave. Eleanor's heart jumped. "They're in," Daniel hissed. Eleanor didn't dare look back. "Keep moving." The mother bobcat growled, her ears flat against her head. She knew danger was close. The voices carried through the tunnel. "There's fresh ash here. Someone's been here recently." Another voice cursed. Where the hell did they go? Eleanor's pulse pounded. Just a little further. Then light. A small opening ahead. The other side of the ridge. Daniel pushed through first, emerging into the snowy night. Eleanor followed, gasping as the cold air hit her face. She turned back, helping the bobcat and her cub through. For a moment, relief. They had made it out, but it was short-lived. A voice rang out from the cave. They were here. Eleanor's blood ran cold. The hunters had found the tunnel. Daniel grabbed her arm. "We have to move." But Eleanor's mind was racing. "They'll follow us. They'll keep chasing her. They won't stop." Her gaze shifted to the ridge. An idea struck her, a dangerous one. "Go ahead," she told Daniel. "Get them as far from here as you can." Daniel frowned. "What are you doing?" Eleanor turned to the mother bobcat. "Trust me." She grabbed a thick branch in the ground and hurled it against the nearest tree, making a loud, cracking noise. The hunters would hear it. They'd think she was still in the cave. Daniel's eyes widened in understanding. "You're luring them away?" Eleanor gave a tight nod. "It's the only way." The mother bobcat looked at her, golden eyes filled with something Eleanor couldn't quite name. Was it understanding? Gratitude? Maybe both. Daniel hesitated, then nodded. "Be careful," without another word. He turned and disappeared into trees, the mother bobcat following closely behind, her cub clutched gently in her mouth. Eleanor took a deep breath and ran in the opposite direction. A shout from behind. "There! She's running!" The plan had worked. The hunters had taken the bait. She ran, her boots crunching in the snow, leading them away from the bobcat, away from Daniel. The storm swallowed her footsteps, the wind covering her trail. And then silence. She stopped, panting, her hands on her knees. She had lost them. A small smile touched her lips. The mother bobcat and her cub were safe. For now. She turned and started the long walk home, knowing in her heart this wasn't over yet. The storm had finally started to settle, leaving behind a world covered in a thick blanket of snow. The trees stood silent, their branches heavy with frost, as the moon cast a pale glow over the frozen landscape. Eleanor's breath came in soft clouds as she trudged forward, her boots sinking into the fresh snow. Every step was slow, her body aching from exhaustion, but she couldn't stop now. She had to be sure. Somewhere ahead, hidden deep in the snowy wilderness, the mother bobcat and her cub were safe. Eleanor had led the hunters away, tricking them into searching in the wrong direction, but she needed to find Daniel and confirm that they had made it out unharmed. As she climbed over a small ridge, her heart pounded with uncertainty. What if they didn't escape in time? What if? Then she saw it. A small clearing, tucked between the trees, where a dark figure stood waiting. Daniel. Relief crashed over her like a wave. He raised a hand when he saw her. "Took you long enough," he called, his voice laced with exhaustion but filled with warmth. Eleanor let out a shaky breath, hurrying toward him. "Are they safe?" Daniel stepped aside, revealing a small shelter made from fallen branches and thick foliage. And there, curled up inside, was the mother bobcat, her golden eyes glowing in the moonlight. Nestled beside her, wrapped in the safety of her warmth, was a cub, alive. Eleanor dropped to her knees, a lump forming in her throat. The tiny creature, once half dead in the snow, now slept peacefully, its tiny chest rising and falling in steady breaths. She swallowed hard. They made it. Daniel nodded, watching the scene unfold before him. "Yeah, thanks to you." The mother bobcat lifted her head, her gaze locking onto Eleanor's. Something passed between them in that moment, an understanding beyond words. Gratitude. Eleanor reached out a hand, slowly, carefully. The mother bobcat didn't move away this time. Instead, she simply blinked, her body relaxed. Eleanor let her fingers brush against the thick fur. It was warm, alive. For a while, neither of them spoke. The only sound was the soft whisper of the wind and the occasional crack of ice shifting in the trees. Finally, Daniel broke the silence. "So what now?" Eleanor exhaled. "Now we let them go." Daniel frowned. "You sure? They might still need." Eleanor shook her head. "She came to me because she had no other choice. But now she does." The mother bobcat had proven her strength. She had carried her dying cub through the storm, fought through the odds, and now she had a second chance. Eleanor wouldn't take that from her. She stood up, brushing the snow from her coat. "Come on," she said softly. "We should go before the hunters circle back." Daniel hesitated, then sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. "Guess this is goodbye, then." Eleanor glanced at the bobcat one last time. The mother watched her in return, her golden eyes glowing in the darkness. And then she stood. Slowly, she stretched her powerful limbs, nudging her cub gently, urging it to follow. The tiny creature blinked sleepily before stumbling to its feet. Eleanor held her breath. The mother bobcat turned one last time, meeting Eleanor's gaze. And in that quiet, frozen moment, there was something undeniable in her eyes. A thank you. Then, without a sound, she turned and disappeared into the trees, her cub trotting closely behind her. Eleanor watched them go, her heart heavy yet full at the same time. Daniel let out a low whistle. Well, that was something. Eleanor smiled faintly. Yeah. They stood there for a while, watching the snow fall, before finally turning to leave. As they walked away, Eleanor cast one final glance over her shoulder, toward the spot where the mother bobcat had vanished. Somewhere, deep in the wilderness, she knew they would thrive. And that was enough.